Well, thank you, Kristen. That was quite the welcome and an introduction. I appreciate that very much. We do have a pretty full program this evening, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. First, I want to say thank you for joining us tonight. I hope that you get a lot out of this. If you are an avid hunter and you already know a lot about Sitka black-tailed deer, I hope that you get some new nuggets of information that maybe you didn't already know, or maybe you get some ideas of different ways to pursue deer in a different way that you hadn't thought of before. So without further ado, we have hunting and natural history of Sitka black-tailed deer. And this, my friends, is a Sitka blacktail. These are a subspecies of the mule deer, and it's a close relative to the Columbia black-tailed deer, just a bit smaller and stockier. This is a buck captured on one of our trail cams. This is a pretty standard size buck, 2 points. This is about the size that you'll find. These are its relatives. We have the white-tailed deer there on the left, and those of you might be familiar with its telltale white tail that flies like a flag when it's startled and running away. And then the mule deer, which is slightly larger, typically, than the white-tailed deer. These two deer are more commonly found down south, although incidental sightings have been seen up in the interior and northern Southeast Alaska, where their ranges are actually starting to just overlap into Alaska somewhat. But back to Sitka black-tailed deer, their home ranges are closely tied to the coastal rainforest, and why we'll talk about a little bit further into the presentation. Mule deer are found in adjacent habitats to the east, so closer in toward interior areas of Oregon, Washington, British Columbia, and the Yukon. Juneau is about the northern edge of the original range of the Sitka blacktail. Later, they were introduced to areas of the Yakutat Forelands, Prince William Sound, and the islands of Kodiak and the surrounding islands in that region. In Alaska, the Sitka black-tailed deer range is seen in red. You can see southeast there is a pretty healthy stock of Sitka blacktail. Yakutat is in there, as well as Prince William Sound and the islands of Kodiak and around there. Okay, let's start talking specifically about this deer. How do you know if you are on the right track when you are pursuing these in the field? Let's talk about tracks, browse, beds, and everything else that might give you clues that you're in the right spot. So tracks, of course, is a great way to know that you're in good deer habitat. A track often has 3 parts. So a small entrance hole where the hoof went down, a narrow section where the leg pivoted forward, and then a larger exit hole. Sometimes when that hoof comes out of the snow, it'll kind of drag forward. If they are in snow, often that happens in dirt, sand. But what you will see often when they're just walking is you will see the front hoof come down and then the back hoof come almost right on top of that front hoof. From tip to tail of that hoof print, it's about 2.5 to 3 inches. The right hand vertical image there, that's a stride, and that stride length there, those 3 track prints, that's about 20 inches. Of course, this is a deer that was presumably walking. If the deer were moving at a faster clip, even running, those tracks would look much different. And so just take that into consideration. But this is a typical Sitka black-tailed deer track when it's just walking. Beds. Beds are a fantastic sign to look for in the woods. You want to get down close, look closely at the bed. Is there any fresh hair there? Another tip, if you know that you're in an area where maybe you've seen deer recently, it's an area that maybe you hunt often, go ahead and take off your glove and touch that area. Is it warm? Does it have any scent on it? Really do get to know these areas if you're seeing them in areas that you hunt frequently, and then sit down and get a deer eye view. Take note of game trails that approach this bed and maybe areas that they might exit if they were to see you, coming up the hill or spy a predator coming toward them. But also think about how you could secretively approach these areas. We'll talk more in the presentation about why deer use these beds, and you'll know, we'll talk about, they do use them for quite a long time, and they'll use them for protection, sometimes nasty weather, but often just to digest their food. Another sign is hair. Often you'll see this, in the winter, but you can see it any time of year. It will get snagged on game trails, on overhanging branches. Devil's Club can be pretty prickly often. And they'll also get snagged on roots and logs that they're going over or under. So look for this. But in the winter, it's also a good time to look for this because their coat changes. We'll talk about that in a second. But those hairs are more brittle than the summer coat. Pellet groups are a fantastic sign. What I like about examining pellet groups is not only you can see how many are there in an area, that gives you a somewhat of an idea of how many deer are in the area, but you can look closely at pellet groups and really determine, how long was it since this deer was here? Are they fresh? Are they not so fresh? It's hard to say, oh, this deer was here an hour ago. But if you look closely, a very fresh deer pellet will still retain the striations on it from the intestine. An exceptionally fresh pellet group will still have mucus on it. If you're brave, you can touch it. No harm in that. Just some little, look for evidence of how fresh it is. A pellet group that has been there a while, its edges might be blurred. It might look more mushy than actually individual pellets. That also can change over the course of a year based on diet. But in the winter, because their diet is largely a woody one, pellet groups are commonly, they look like this, they hold together better. If the pellet group has mold on it, or if it looks somewhat dry, it's probably been through a couple of weather cycles, maybe even a season, and that one's not so fresh. Rubs on trees are also a good indicator that there are deer in the area, of course. Bucks will do this. And so when you see a rub on a tree, take a look at it closely. An older rub will be scabbed over, as you can see kind of at the top of the scope there. That's maybe an older rub, but a fresher rub like the one down below is going to be maybe actively shiny. Maybe it will still have a scent to it. It may have some sap oozing from it. I remember hunting on Admiralty, and as I was walking down a game trail, I caught that distinctive scent of Devil's Club. When you break off a Devil's Club branch or you rub against it vigorously, you get that scent. And I walked around the corner and I looked, and sure enough, there was this poor Devil's Club trying to continue to right itself, but a buck had come and rubbed so vigorously on it that it had taken off that outside bark, and it was so fresh you could still smell that Devil's Club scent. So just some clues to look for when you're out in the woods. So other things, of course, to look at is browse. So what are deer nibbling on? And deer and hare often will choose blueberry bushes. And the way that you can tell whether or not it's been a hare or a deer that has nibbled on it is by looking at the way that the branch is cut. Because hares have scissor-like teeth, they have those incisors that overlap each other. They will create a very clean cut, sometimes at an angle. Deer, because they don't have any teeth on top, just a tough upper palate, and they have teeth on the bottom, they will bite and then they'll tear. So often, because blueberry is a woody, shrub, there'll be kind of strands coming off of that browsed area, and it won't be so clean. Another way to tell is the location of the browse. If it's up quite high, it's probably not a hare. If it's down low, a clean cut, it probably was a hare that took that. So what do deer eat? Well, they're definitely browsers, not grazers. So they'll move through an area and take a little bit of everything. And they are very opportunistic when it comes to what they eat. They eat a lot of a variety of things, especially in the summer. In the spring, skunk cabbage is a very important food because it's high in protein, and deer are coming out of that winter season with low fat reserves. And so they're looking for a highly digestible protein source that will help get their body back in good physical condition. Lucky for deer, they are unique in their ability to digest this plant. Skunk cabbage is largely indigestible for most animals. Deer and bear are the exception because it has a fiber in it that's a lot like eating fiberglass. if we would try to eat it, we'd be very uncomfortable. It would get stuck in our gums. It'd be absolutely terrible, but deer are able to eat it with no problem. And in the spring, if you come across skunk cabbage that looks like the photo on the left, that's a deer. They'll come in and just nip off those fresh buds. They will even select skunk cabbage throughout the season. As you can see in the upper right photo, that skunk cabbage, the leaves have been nibbled down, and deer have been known to frequent the same skunk cabbage patch throughout the year, even into September. So just keep that in mind. If you're out moving through an area where you know skunk cabbage grows, take a look at those leaves a little closer. The summer diet of a Sitka blacktail, like I mentioned before, is wide in its variety. They will browse on just about everything that is native to our region. They'll even eat things like devil's club. In the spring specifically, those young new growth, they'll nip off the tips of those. And, you know, they're known to eat plants that are even poisonous to us. They won't eat the berries of devil's club, but they are opportunistic, like I mentioned. The winter diet, things change. And in the winter, deer will eat evergreen forbs when available. In fact, that photo in the center is arguably one of the most important food sources for deer in the winter because areas of our forest have these very old, tall, old growth stands. The snow is not able to accumulate in great depths on the forest floor. And so these evergreen forbs are often still available for deer. So a very important source of food, high in protein, highly digestible. The second most important is probably woody browse, which they'll switch to. And the one that they select for often is the blueberry. That's down in the lower left. And what they're looking for is the new growth from that year on the end of the blueberry bush. And that's more nutritious, a little bit easier for them to digest. And, but, you know, they also have been known to browse on cedar and hemlock, and then also lichen, such as like old man beard that we commonly know it as. Okay, speaking of summer and winter, deer have two different types of coats. And how are they different and why? Well, in the summer, deer have a reddish coat, almost like a copper color. And this coat is, I'm letting some folks into the waiting room. So if you're just arriving, welcome. This coat is a thinner coat. It lacks the underfur of the winter coat. And it actually has more hair per area. And that is to help kind of keep those insects at bay. The winter coat is thicker in that it has these guard hairs that lay on top of a fluffy undercoat. And those guard hairs are hollow. So they actually help trap air in, help the deer insulate a little bit better. And those are the brittle hairs that you could potentially see pulled off on shrubs and branches, like I was mentioning earlier. And of course, that coloration is more of a gray, more of a tan coloration. And the timing of the molt is different, but typically deer are in the reddish color phase only about 4 or so months out of the year. And the timing of the molt has to do with the age of the deer. Typically, the older the deer, the sooner it will molt. The healthier the deer, the sooner it will molt. But they don't all change color quite at the same time. Winter movements. So deer, and we'll talk about this a couple of times during this presentation, but deer truly do move with the snow line. And so as winter sets in, deer will descend out of the alpine if that's where they are, and they'll be pushed down by the snow. They're moving down, of course, in search of areas that are more snow-free, in search of food. And in times when that snow gets quite deep, when we have really heavy snow years, you can find them all the way down on the beach. You know, winter is tough on deer. And I bring this up because they really are on a maintenance diet. And so deer that persists into April is really hard on deer populations. On the flip side, though, those that do survive tough winters will rebound often, since there's less competition for food as winter pulls out of the region. And, you know, there's some of you maybe have remembered the year of 2006, 2007, when tough winter, persistent winter killed a lot of deer. We had a 90% die off in 2008, but within 8 years, and we'll look at some stats here in a little bit, the deer population was able to rebound. So they are not a static population by any means, but because of our solid habitat here in the region, they are so far able to bounce right back. All right, shifting gears a little bit into life history. And why do I go over life history when I'm talking about hunting? Well, when you're hunting, you also, I think this is part of the fun, is you want to start to kind of guess how the deer might be moving, what they might be thinking, what they might be looking for during that particular time of year. And so I think it's helpful to have a little background on how deer move throughout the year. So starting with life, fawns are born in June, sometimes July, but June is most common. And there's no scent at first. So mom can leave them while she forages. Fawns, when they're first born, they just don't have enough strength to follow her all over the place. So they have what's called a drop reflex. And this is an interesting video here on this next slide. You can see there's spots on the back. They're meant to be camouflaged from, of course, predators, but it's meant to mimic the light filtering through the canopy. Oh, I missed it. Let's play that again. There we go. So you can see here's a little close-up of the fawn. And this is pulled back. You see how well that fawn is concealed. So this is their drop reflex. This is Steve Bethune, our sick area biologist. And sometimes animals will be in a place where they just really shouldn't be, and people will think that that animal is abandoned. Well, it's not. In fact, mom was just off foraging, and that animal had to be was in the wrong spot. So Steve, as you can see, was wearing gloves. He very carefully picked up that animal and put it back in the grass. If you were to come across this situation, best thing to do is just take a step back, give us a call, but chances are if you just let that animal be, mom will come back to retrieve it in no time. Okay. So moving forward from being born, the bucks will begin to grow antlers. And in its first year, you can see the button buck on the left there. They're just a little nubbin, and the beginnings of antlers grow from what's called a pedicle. By the second year, typically you'll have a spike buck like the one in the upper right. So how do antlers form? You know, how does the spike buck go from this fantastic rack? Or why do spike bucks stay, relatively small sometimes? Well, it all comes down to nutrition, and truly diets rich in protein, diets rich in diversity do help antlers grow more robust. Age, of course, plays a role. When a buck reaches maturity up until a certain age, its antlers will progressively grow more and more complex. The bases will continue to largen. But as that buck reaches a certain age, once he gets older than that, it typically goes the other direction. And of course, antlers are shed every year and regrown. Genetics plays a role, hormone plays a role. And then antlers are also pretty susceptible to injury and disease. So during the growth phase, they can get knocked, they can get damaged, and that can cause one side or maybe both to be a little bit misshapen. Then, of course, if the animal has a disease of some kind, that'll affect their ability to absorb nutrition and change antler growth. This is a buck in early August, late July. And for bucks, antler growth is quite rapid. They are highly vascular bone, actually. It's warm to the touch. It's very sensitive, and it grows very rapidly, between a ½ inch to sometimes up to 1 inch per day. Like I mentioned earlier, susceptible to injury, but it's, interestingly enough, the fastest growing tissue of any mammal. So once once the antler growth is complete, the buck will shed, and it'll do that either by rubbing that velvet on its back or against the trees, the rub marks that I talked about earlier. And they have the capacity to rub off that velvet in a very short period, sometimes within a day. At that point, they're entering into the rut likely, and a buck will attempt to mate with many does during that time, and they will defend does. For hunters, bucks are receptive to calls during the rut. And of course, the next question is, well, when does that happen? Well, the timing of the rut is variable, but it's often between October and November. There is no set start date. And exactly when it starts and when it turns off, we're not entirely sure. But during that time, you can bring them in with the Sitka black-tailed deer call. Just know, though, if you decide to use a call, a deer might not be the only thing that you bring in. There are other animals such as bears that will key in on that sound. You know, the other recommendation I give is that if you are going to use a call, find a place to sit where you have a good field of view, blow that call a couple times, and then be patient. People have waited for many minutes for that buck. And I've heard stories of people just about to get up when all of a sudden the buck comes walking out. And it's kind of cool because you can call that animal in somewhat close, closer than you would otherwise typically see it. And as far as also harvesting an animal in the rut, I've talked to a couple people who say they really don't care for harvesting a buck in the rut because, you know, they have these scent glands right on their hindquarters, kind of down by what I guess would be their knee, I guess. And those have a pretty strong scent, and they'll use those to scent mark. And so they can sometimes just incidentally, you'll get that scent on the meat. You want to try to avoid that, of course. But some people just say that they feel like the meat has a different flavor when the buck is in the rut. So what's the size of a Sitka black-tailed deer? Well, the one pictured is a very large, mature black-tailed buck. This is a 4-point rack. This one is about 180 pounds, but a typical buck is about 100 to 120 pounds. A 3-point rack is more typical, and a doe will weigh in at about 80 to 100 pounds for a mature doe. So speaking of does, let's talk reproduction for a second. Does will breed during their second year of life and continue producing fawns every year until they reach 10 or 12 years of age. Prime age does, which is the 5 to 10 year category, typically produce 2 fawns annually, and deer will live about 10 to 15 years. Does typically come into estrus in mid-October, again, kind of coincides with the rut, and a doe that does not get pregnant in October will be fertile again in November. So earlier I mentioned that does typically drop fawns in June. Well, a doe that has been bred in November will likely have her fawn in early July instead of June. Home ranges. So in this section, I'm going to talk a little bit about migratory deer and resident deer. Those are the terms I'm going to use. But just keep in mind as I'm talking about that, migratory deer, it's not a true migration in the sense that you might know from caribou or, you know, birds, but they do move more vigorously across the landscape over the course of a year than say a resident deer. And my battery is low, so let me plug this in. I don't want to lose you all. Stand by. We just averted a massive technical glitch. Okay, so as you can see here on the screen, deer have a home range and they learn where those resources are. Some deer live their entire lives in a 30-acre area where they were born. We know this because radio-collared deer on Admiralty Island average about 200 acres. Migratory deer, those I was talking about who range further, they have a larger annual home range. And the average distance between summer and winter range is about 5 miles. So it's not that far, but for resident deer, it's maybe just a half mile or so. This is this is 2 videos spliced together, sped up twice as fast. This is of 2 deer collared taken in 2012. This is a pretty cool video that illustrates how deer who have a small home range will move within their habitat. So this is, as you can see, it's in June, late June actually. And, you know, this deer is selecting for somewhat open forested area. It's been previously logged. You can see it moves throughout kind of the edges of the forest. It roams over here, you know, in the muskeg near the water, but really it doesn't go very far. And so even a month later, the deer has not moved that far. This is deer 35, later summer. As you can see, it's also selecting for areas of second growth, moving through the edges of that area. Looks like it's going up and down some drainages, but also selecting for the edge of the muskeg. And even into September, this deer is just really happy with where it's at and its habitat. So this just kind of shows you how far deer can not go. Again, just to reiterate, so this is an illustration of a year in the life of a Southeast deer following the food in a typical island watershed. Down at number 1, this is late winter. As the snow melts, that deer is going to follow that snow line up as it follows the green up. It's going to, spend its summer grazing, browsing, rather, up in the alpine. And then as winter sets back in again, it'll move down the drainage and hang out in areas where it has, available resources and shelter and probably food. I threw this one in. Can deer swim? Yes, they can swim. In fact, they swim quite well. So why will they do it? Well, not all habitat is created equal. As deer populations maybe rise in one area, deer will choose to disperse. Maybe it's to avoid predators, access new areas. But yeah, they do swim, in fact. When are deer active? Well, deer are crepuscular, which means that they are most active at dusk and dawn. This is, and why we'll go over in a second, but what they'll do is they will feed at dusk and dawn when they feel safe, and they have the vision to really detect any kind of movement or predators that might be out there. And then they'll bed down to digest their food, because food digestion for deer can take a long time. I've had people ask me, well, what if it's really rainy, or what if it's really windy? Will deer just stay bedded down and wait out the storm? And in Southeast Alaska, it's so rainy and can be so stormy that, I think that they would lose out on some important nutrition if they did that. And so I talked to Dan Ecker, who is a deer biologist and is currently conducting some research on deer. And he has a bunch of deer collared. So last year, during our massive winter storm in early December, I said, hey, Dan, can you pull the locations of your deer and tell me what they're up to? And he's at the point where he has the technology to pull live time data points, and he can see how they're moving over the course of, a day. And he wrote me back and he said, I don't know, they're just doing deer things. And in fact, the deer were completely unfazed by, the sideways wind and rain and snow, and they were out feeding at the times we would think they would be feeding and bedded down in their normal times as well. So the wind and rain may temporarily keep deer from being out and about, but not often here in the region. Like I said, they will bed down to digest their food. They'll find a safe spot. Food requires about 100 hours for complete processing. They have a 4-chambered stomach. You can see that here. There's the rumen, reticulum, the omasum, and the abomasum. And because their food is hard to digest, comparatively speaking, this gives them ample opportunity to extract as many nutrients as possible from their food. So they will sit down there and they will bed down rather, and they will regurgitate, chew it up more, and then swallow it again and continue digesting it. Here's another image of that. So when it comes to a hunter, the last thing you want to do is puncture one of those digestive organs. You run a high risk of completely messing up your meat. Last thing you want to do is get fecal matter on your harvest. And so the best place to aim, of course, is for the heart and the lungs. Those are seen here in light red and dark red. This is an old image, but it still rings true, and I really like it. These are some of the areas to aim when deer are at different angles to you. Please don't shoot a deer when it's angled away. Just a bad idea for many reasons. People will say, well, what about, a headshot? And I would just say to this, and this is what, any hunter education instructor would tell you as well. When you're looking at the mass that you are aiming at, when you are aiming in any of these red circles, it's just a bigger piece of mass to hit. And the chances of you taking you know, taking this animal with ethically and humanely and quickly are very high. The head is not large, and you know, you have the possibility of hitting it in the jaw and then wounding it to the point where it, you know, suffers. So this is an oldie but a goodie. All right, what are the predators of deer? Well, wolves in Southeast, black bears primarily will predate on neonate fawns, occasionally the coyote, but definitely humans. So how do deer survive? How do they evade these predators? Well, they are well adapted with their sense of smell, and it is by far their most important. Deer are able to, with that moist nose, they're able to trap scent particles and really detect them in the air. When you have a light rain, scent travels much easier across the landscape. After a heavy rain, scent will be washed off, but it will quickly rebound and carry very well. Of course, if you are hunting, you want to take note of where the wind is. You want to make sure that you're hunting with the wind coming at you so that your scent is not drifting directly into anything you might be stalking. Deer, of course, also use scent to locate one another and to leave scent trails behind. A doe will be able to locate, or a fawn will be able to locate its mother with her scent. Also, of course, their hearing is an important sense that they use for detecting predators. Each of those large ears moves around independently from one another, and that allows them to pinpoint, triangulate on a sound and pinpoint it exactly. When you see a deer flick its ear back and forth, it's using that to detect sounds in various directions. Deer try to have a very certain sense of where a sound is coming from before they will move away. And deer have become adjusted to sounds that they hear all the time. But take a gunshot, for example. It's a very quick, immediate sound, probably not one that they hear often. And if you've ever aimed at a deer, taken a shot and missed, and that deer stands there, you know, as if it doesn't know what's going on, it's because it isn't sure, because it doesn't know where it's coming from. That immediate shot does not give the deer an opportunity to triangulate the location, so it doesn't know which way it needs to go to flee. So sometimes that does allow the hunter to take a second shot. That's why they do that. All right, sight is also an important adaptation for survival. Deer have very good low light vision, especially the detection of movement. They don't have clearer vision than a human, but they can absolutely detect motion far better than we can, especially at low light, like I mentioned. But also, you know, deer have eyes on the back of their heads. And so while our binocular vision might be far better than theirs, what we can see out of both eyes, their visual field is far greater. And so if you're approaching a deer, chances are, even though you might be somewhat what looks like to you behind it, that deer will still be able to pick up on your movement. So just be aware of that as well when you're out in the field. Aren't deer colorblind? Well, no, not completely. But deer do not perceive the infrared end of the spectrum. So blue is perceived, but not the color red. Take the jelly beans, for example. A lot of different colors in that example there. But then you look at the hunter. And so, you know, you can see the hunter's gun really well. The hunter's vest does not show up as orange, but it does show up as a block of color. People say, well, you know, I never wear camouflage. It doesn't help. It doesn't do anything. Deer are colorblind. But what the camouflage does do is the camouflage helps to break up your profile against the landscape. And so as you can see in the image on the bottom right, if this hunter didn't have on his vest and didn't have his gun, both good things to have, of course, for safety and harvest, he would be much harder to pick up on the landscape. And so that is an advantage of wearing camouflage when you're out hunting. All right, let's talk a little bit about the region, when and where to hunt, and pros and cons. And I will just preface this by saying, whatever you do before you go hunting, make sure you read the rules and regulations for the area you are going to hunt. Okay, but generally speaking, all right, if you're choosing to hunt in late summer, the benefit are that you have long days, right? A lot of sunlight, a lot of time, but the deer are high typically. And so it's going to take a lot of aerobic output to get up to where they are, and it's going to take a lot of strength to get back down. At that time, it is typically bucks only. Let's say you want to go hunt, though, on the ABC Islands, great place to hunt, Admiralty, Chichikov, or Baranof. The bonus there are a lot of deer. There's also a lot of bears. So make sure that you are prepared and comfortable to react appropriately in the case of a bear encounter. Douglas Island is a very popular place to hunt because it's extremely accessible. There is a lot of hunter pressure on Douglas. I have a slide here coming up that shows you just how much. And then there are a few bears, which is a bonus. But do know that if you choose to go hunting on Douglas Island, there is a new doe harvest regulation. And generally speaking, what that is after any deer season on Douglas, which begins September 15th, each hunter is only allowed to harvest one doe per season. That's it. And after you harvest that doe, evidence of sex on the buck that you may happen to harvest afterward is naturally attached. Particularly if you're going to hunt Douglas, I highly recommend that you read the new regulation and that you understand it before you go hunting. If you have any questions, just call us. Shifting into fall and winter, typically this is any deer season. So after September 15th, except areas of the mainland and some other areas in Southeast Alaska, you can harvest a doe or a buck. You know, there could be snow on the ground, which makes tracking easy. And then as we get into these winter months, of course, that first hard frost and snow will begin to push the deer to lower elevations, making them a little bit easier to get to and to find. So this is, we're going to talk some statistics here. So these are harvest statistics of Sitka black-tailed deer in Southeast Alaska and other areas of the state in 2020. So in particular, what did I just want to point out to you when it comes to this slide is that the ABC Islands can be a very productive place to hunt. You can see if you look at the far right column that out of all the other areas, it had the highest hunter success rate. However, if you look at the number of hunters, quite a few hunters were pursuing animals on those islands, and they were successful. The total deer harvested last year on the ABC Islands was 5,059. Coming up right behind that was the area of Kodiak, and you know, they had just about as many hunters as the ABC Islands, and they did have success. And then just kind of looking a little closer to home, I have Juneau, Douglas highlighted there, and that number of hunters has been stayed pretty solid over the past years. There was a total of 346 deer harvested on Douglas, and you can see as you look through the other areas, just the success rate in the various areas of Southeast Alaska. And if you want, feel free to pick up your phone and take a screenshot of this just so you can come back and reference it later. What's interesting is if I go to the next slide. So I talked earlier about how a tough winter can really have a hard hit on our deer populations. Well, if you look here, this was 2007, and then we have 2015. And there were the ABC Islands, we saw, 2,000 deer harvested there. And then within just a few years, that number went up again. When you look at other areas, deer per hunter, it was down, and then it was able to rebound in a lot of these areas. And so deer have the ability to rebound. But one thing to look at, 1C is Douglas. From 2007 to 2015, we had 706 versus 796 hunters. And, last year we still had 745 hunters. So hunter pressure on Douglas has been pretty stable. Okay, if you do decide to hunt near Juneau, just know that there's no hunting deer within a quarter mile of coastline along the road system. And that area is noted in red. There's no deer hunting allowed at all in the Mendenhall Valley or on the Mendenhall wetlands. Hunting on CBJ property is allowed, but a person cannot discharge firearms within 1.25 miles of any public street, road, or highway within the borough. We have this in the regs as well, or if you have questions, feel free to call us. All right, I wanted to touch on my last section, which is planning a single day hunt. And if you're new to hunting, or you just want to get some ideas on where to go to, like, not ideas on a new location, but if you are looking at pursuing a new hunt in a place you've never been, these are some good things to keep in mind. So I just have this kind of brief checklist here. Of course, whenever you're going hunting, buddy system is a great idea. It's very important to bring a buddy. The other thing you want to do before you head out is you want to check the weather, especially as winter comes into full effect here. Check the tides. Absolutely. They can be pretty, you can have pretty high highs and pretty low lows. Check sunrise and sunset, because as we all know, being Alaskans, the days get shorter and shorter. If you're going to a new area, or even if it's an area that you've been before, highly recommend studying topographic maps of the area that you plan to hunt. Take note of where the cliff bands are. Take note of what is beyond the watershed that you might be heading on, or maybe up the ridgeline. And then if it's a brand new area, you know, really do look at that closely as to what kinds of areas might hold deer. Meadows, draws, water. And then use Google Earth or Gaia to determine your distance or to plan your route. I just started using Gaia this year. I don't know it took me so long. I'm really impressed with it. You can download it on your phone. It will track your route even when there's no cell service. And then there's also a computer-based version online. Use whatever works for you though. Make sure you have transportation arranged. Make sure you have communication gear with you and you know how to use it. Highly recommend having 2 different types. Of course, there's not a lot of cell phone service in many parts of Southeast Alaska. And so your cell phone, of course, may not work, but also make sure that you have a backup. Maybe it's, you know, a Spot or a Garmin Mini or an InReach, whatever you have, make sure you practice with it as well. And that your subscription's up to date. Ran into that problem before. Always take your survival kit with you. You never know when you're going to have to stay in the woods overnight, and then have your trip plan. I can't stress this one enough. Make sure that someone, whether it's a friend, family member, the Coast Guard, they know where you're going, how many people are in your party, when you plan to return, when to be worried, and when to contact the authorities if you have not returned, what you're wearing, the gear you have with you, are other important things to share in that trip plan. If you want to have a more in-depth checklist for hunting, go to hunt.alaska.gov and click on the general planning link. There's some good information too there. All right, just a very general kind of example of how you could plan out a hunt. South Douglas Island is an area, I'm not giving away any secrets here, but South Douglas Island is an area that has some pretty good topographical habitat to potentially hold deer. So you study the map, go onto Google Earth and look, okay, so where could I anchor a boat? Where could I, you know, where's the muskeg? You can pivot that in that app and see a 3D rendering of the landscape. And then using that same app, you can plot a course, and it'll give you how far it is from where you are going to begin hunting to where you are headed. And in this case, it's 1.55 miles at 296 degrees roughly. Of course, you want to make sure that you've taken the tides into consideration, that you anchor your boat far enough out. It's not going to go dry, and that transportation to and from the boat is light enough, but sturdy enough to carry you and your hunting party and anything you may harvest. Of course, always stash that up far above the high tide line and attach it to something sturdy like a tree. That's always an important thing to do. Once you are in the woods, if it's a brand new area to hunt, this is a colleague of mine, Riley Woodford, and he's helped put together this presentation. But why is this slide here? Well, when you are in a new area that you are looking to hunt, first thing you want to look for are game trails. And you can see one game trail going off to the left and behind Riley there. Game trails are great ways to move across the landscape. Not only is it typically, it's quieter to go across a game trail because you're not going up and over shrubs and logs and downfall, but also animals tend to choose the path of least resistance. And if you are so lucky to harvest a deer, congratulations, but I want to remind everyone the first thing you should do is absolutely punch your harvest ticket before you do anything else. And then you can carry on with the rest of the hard work there. And so when we're talking about from field to table, There's many ways to get the meat out of the field, but here are some important notes that I want everyone to remember. Of course, always keep the meat clean, cool, and dry. And do follow the proper steps for meat care to avoid waste. So what I mean by that, well, some people prefer to make something of a deer backpack like this gentleman did. And this is not a bad option. You know, the hide is still on, it's keeping all that meat really clean. And, you know, this is a good option if you are not too far away from your mode of transportation or the beach where it's easier walking. This is a heavy way to transport your deer, but you know, it's not a bad one if the situation is ripe for it. If you do decide to carry your deer like this, make sure that you are wearing something highly visible so that another hunter doesn't mistake you for a live animal. If there was snow on the ground, the other thing you could do is leave the hide on the animal and use a drag rope to throw around the antlers or around the head and drag that deer instead of carrying it. And then, of course, if you were high in the alpine, early in the season, a lot of hunters will decide to bone out the meat. That's not a bad option. It does reduce heft, but you do run the risk of the meat may not cool as quickly because you have many pieces laying one against each other, or you have the opportunity to introduce, you know, moss or branches or twigs or other types of things that could harbor bacteria, make your lives a little difficult later. But anyway, the point is that there's many different ways to get the meat out of the field. Just make sure that you're doing it properly and to avoid waste. And then make sure you understand all salvageable meat requirements. So that includes taking all the neck meat. And this diagram down here generally outlines the things that are required. So all the neck meat, all the chest meat, the brisket, all the meat of the ribs, front quarters to the knee and the hind quarters to the hock, and then all the meat along the backbone, which includes the backstrap and the tenderloins. But again, be sure to make sure to check the conditions for your hunt for any additional salvage requirements. That is very important because they are not always all the same. So you, after doing all these things, if you're successful, you're able to reap the rewards of your efforts. And deer meat venison is truly an enjoyable thing to share with family and friends. And with that, I'll conclude. Thanks so much. Does anybody have any questions? We do have about 8 minutes left and we can go as long as people have time for.
Yeah, feel free to put questions in the chat box or turn your camera on and just join in the conversation.
So Meredith is asking, you suggested snagging a photo, but I wasn't fast enough. All right, you want me to go back to harvest from 2020, Meredith?
The one that makes the case for going to the ABC Islands over Douglas.
You got it. So this is last year's 2020 deer harvest statistics. And as you can see, you know, ABC is great. But there's other areas of Southeast Alaska that are also quite productive. But yeah, you know, ABC, it looks like a lot of people are buying boats or taking planes. My goodness, that's great. You know, ABC is a good one because even though it has, it looks like it has a lot of hunters hanging, you know, heading out there, a lot of deer, a lot of space for everyone to spread out. So yeah, it's not a bad option. Any other questions?
I'll give a pro tip about scat down in the rainforest. Because it's always wet down there. So a lot of the scat you're going to see is wet. This could be for elk or deer or moose. So when the scat is wet, how do you tell if it's wet from the rain or it's wet because it's fresh? So the way that you do that is you take some, you pinch it between your thumb and index finger, and then you lift it up and you open your fingers. And if it sticks on your finger from the mucus, that means that it's fresh because the mucus hasn't washed off yet. If it falls right out of your hand, that's because it's wet from the rain.
That's great.
It's a little tidbit, you know.
Thanks, Mike. Mike is my educational counterpart in Fairbanks, but he often comes down and tromps around in our rainforest down here. So
And Abby, do you see there's a question in the chat?
I see it. So I got a question here that says, do bucks respond to grunt calls? I see a lot of video with people using fawn or doe calls. So that's a good question. And I would say try them both out. What I've typically seen people have success with are fawn and doe calls, and that's probably why there's videos of them out there, people using them. But I've also heard that, you know, they'll respond to grunt too, and I couldn't imagine why they wouldn't, because, you know, they will defend their harem, if you will, and so they might feel threatened and come over to investigate or, you know, throw their weight around a little bit. And Roy Churchwell is still on the line with us, and so Roy, feel free to weigh in on any of these if you have additional info that I don't touch on or anything like that. Roy is our area biologist for the Juneau area.
Yeah, sure. I could touch on the federal closure hunting around Angoon. So that's for federal subsistence, or actually the deal with that is that Juneau is in a non-subsistence area. So Juneau residents don't qualify under subsisting hunting regulations under federal subsistence. And so there's a petition through the Federal Subsistence Board to close the area around Goon and a portion of the western part of Admiralty Island, as well as two other areas within the ABCs, Puna and the area around Pelican, to give a subsistence preference to those areas. So we'll have to see how that goes through the Federal Subsistence Board. So far, it looks like it's might pass. As a state agency, we are allowed to provide our comments, and both residents in Juneau and subsistence residents can also provide their comments on that through the Subsistence Board commenting when they have their meeting. Other than that, the state Fish and Game doesn't have a lot of say in how that moves forward. So we can comment on it. We can provide some data, and it's just whether the Subsistence Board, how they decide to use that data in their decision, whether they say that they want to allow this to go through or not. So I'm not sure that that's the best explanation, but feel free to give me a call here at the Fish and Game office, and I could talk through it some more with you if you have more questions.
Roy, we did get a question about what and when are our opportunities to comment on these petitions?
Yeah, I don't have those dates memorized. Once again, feel free to get in touch with me and I can get you those dates. It's not right away, I guess I'll say that, though. You do have a little bit of time.
So I'm gonna also punt this to the Scat Master. Sometimes we got a question here that she says, sometimes when you see Scat, it's in a more smooth and less solid state than pellets. Does this mean anything about their diet or how old it is? And I said, it has simply to do with probably a change in diet, but can you tell how old it is, Mike?
Well, yeah, the change in the form of the scat is all related to diet. How can you tell how old it is from that individual scat? Yeah, relatively, but it's all dependent on weather conditions and, you know, things like that. How fast it's drying out. So yeah, but you can, but you got to know the conditions at that specific area. Yeah. But all ungulate scat will turn from pellet form to more amorphous when they're eating a diet of greens and not woody material.
Thanks. Good questions. Any others out there? Roy, this is a great question that just came in for you. Could you provide any insight as to the deer population on the mainland around Juneau as compared to Douglas and also to the ABCs?
Yeah, sure. So there's no doubt that the ABCs have the highest deer population by far. They may have the highest deer population in the state, although Kodiak might argue with that on occasion. Yeah, hunting on the ABCs is where the highest deer population is. My reports from hunters this year around Douglas and the mainland is that they've been seeing quite a bit of sign on the mainland, but I haven't heard of a lot of harvest there. And then on Douglas, it sounds like it's been a little better year than it has been for the past couple of years. So I've heard of quite a few successful hunters on Douglas this year.
Thanks. Oh, this is a great question. Have you seen any changes? You know, hunters, of course, when they report their harvest, they have to report kind of generally where they took the animal. Have you seen anything change since the Pioneer Road opened, Roy?
Not for sure. That isn't something that I've looked into necessarily with our hunt statistics. The coding that we have is for all of Douglas Island, so it doesn't necessarily break it out by parts of the island. So we don't really know for sure what part of the island folks are hunting on unless they're talking to us individually. I do know that that is a popular place for people to hop off and start hunting. And so I imagine that with the road, it probably did, or I'm certain that it improved access for folks for sure. I don't know if it pulled hunters from other areas to go back there. I think some of the folks that hunt other parts of the island probably still hunt those areas because that's where they knew best.
There's a question here. I think, Roy, this one is also for you. There's an anecdotal, well, he's been told that there's harvest on Prince William Sound that has been significantly down. Is that due to last winter's snow or something else?
Yeah, that would be my suspicion. I have to admit that I'm more familiar with Southeast deer numbers than Prince William Sound. But definitely snow, you know, in the Yakutat area and further north there was pretty substantial. And I'd be surprised if deer didn't take a little bit of a hit. I did hear that Kodiak, the snow did have a little bit of an impact on the deer population there this last winter.
I heard the same thing. Good questions, you guys.
Well, Abby, thank you so much. That was great, having you launch our wildlife series. And I hope those of you who are on the call this evening will also be joining us in the coming months. Next month's talk will be by Tom Seaton, a research biologist up in Fairbanks. And Mike, you want to just give a little highlight for the wood bison presentation?
Yeah, yeah.
Join us for that.
Yeah, you don't want to miss it. It's going to be Tom Seaton and Wes Olson, who's a famous bison guy from the lower 48 and knows everything about plains bison. And they're gonna co-present about the update about the wood status of the wood bison in Alaska and the future, what the future holds for wood bison. So it should be fascinating as usual. So make sure you tune in and spread the word.
Yeah, and then we're gonna take, the month of December, we're gonna be skipping, but then in January, we're gonna hold 2 presentations, one on the sheep research that's happening with 3 folks out of the Fairbanks area as well, Brad Wedling, Tom Loheis, and Joe Want. We'll also have a presentation by Karen Glavis on her little brown bear research in Southeast. And that'll be in the end of January. And then in February, Sue Rodman's going to be giving a presentation on fire for wildlife enhancement. And then we'll be going into March with Dave Sawfield, who's area manager out of Anchorage, talking about the Anchorage news surveys that they've done with citizen involvement there. And then also we're going to have one on the Alaska hare research that Travis Boones and Chris Barger, our research biologists up in Fairbanks, will be presenting later on this spring. So stay tuned. We'll be putting announcements out on Facebook and on Instagram and also on Fishing Game's website. You can look at the events calendar and we list all of the presentations and we'll register and we'll see, it may be that some of these can go into some live in person in the not too distant future, but we're really happy that you joined us virtually. And I hope you all have a wonderful deer season. And the snow is coming in Southeast, so that is always kind of that sign of deer coming down lower, making it a little bit easier for folks, I think. So enjoy. And Abby, again, thanks for your presentation this evening.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Thank you for coming, everyone. Thank you and have a wonderful night.